Well, last week, the Supreme Court of Alabama ruled that frozen embryos left over from IVF procedures had the same legal rights as children and that wrongful death laws should be applied should they be killed. Now, my next guest is well qualified to help us understand the implications of this ruling. David Van Ghent is a GP from Toowoomba in Queensland. He's been involved in the public debate on pro-life issues for 30 years, and he speaks today as a pro-life advocate, not as a doctor. He has briefed MPs in state and federal parliament on subjects like cloning, euthanasia, the abortion drug RU486, and in 2006 addressed a group of United States senators in Washington on stem cell research. That same year, the medical magazine Australian Doctor listed David as one of Australia's 50 most intriguing GPs. I'm pleased to call him a friend, and I recorded this conversation with him earlier in the week. Well, David, it's fantastic to have you joining us today. Really appreciate your time. Did the Alabama Supreme Court get it right in ruling that microscopic IVF embryos are part of the human family?
Well, they did biologically and in their terms legally, because there was nothing in their Wrongful Death of Minors Act that excluded the very youngest of the unborn children, who were already included in their protections. So it made sense legally. It's fascinating culturally and ethically. I think that it's a great opportunity for people to think again about the whole meaning of human life in its very earliest stages. Because biologically, of course, a human embryo is part of the human family. Anyone who loves their offspring knows that in their heart. But biologically, we begin on day one and we continue through to natural death as the same being, the same human existence, even though we continually change our appearance, our capacities. But I find what's most helpful, Lyle, is to think of what really happens on that first day of conception of a new being. Essentially, a new name is spoken, a name that's never existed before. It's a genetic name, a genetic identity, which takes a whole lifetime to be spoken, a whole lifetime to be expressed. And it's that identity which is our name. It is what and who we are. It's what makes us part of the human family. And we should treasure that. We shouldn't reach over and delete this character from our story by dropping it on the laboratory floor like happened in Alabama.
Yeah, well, this is, of course, what happens in Australia. And I guess this ruling last week has brought this issue back into focus again, because many couples are striving to conceive and have a family. And I think you and I, share that desire and would want that for our friends who are childless. And you as a GP, I know, deal with patients like this all the time. Is there an ethical way to go about IVF that doesn't create excess embryos? Because in America alone, and I guess this is what's driven the Alabama decision, there are some millions of unused human embryos, which, as you say, are a new life in Australia. There would be who knows how many. How do we deal with the issue of IVF in knowing what we know about the ethics?
True. This is the heart of it. For those people who are proceeding with IVF, they must assert their own values in this field. They do not have to allow the laboratories to create multiple embryos. They don't have to. Of course, the laboratories will want to, because they want to get the best percentage outcome for their clients. They want a higher percentage of take-home babies. And if you make a whole lot of embryos and you pick and choose male, female, quality, whatever looks best, you're giving the clients the best chance. Okay, but to do that is to imply that the embryo is material that we can sift like material and dispose of like material. And that's a very big ethical call. Whereas parents who are going down this path can insist that no, any offspring that we conceive through this method of IVF must be given the same chance of life as any other offspring, must be treated with the same unconditional love and acceptance and welcome as any other offspring. So dear Professor, dear Doctor, thank you for your assistance, but when you help us to conceive and you conceive an embryo, it is to be put straight into the mother's womb, no questions asked.
So what does that look like practically, David?
Parents can do that, but it's very hard.
It's very, okay. So it's obviously a lot harder because to make the process easy, because it's quite an invasive and often traumatic and difficult process for women, that's why they seem to create multiple excess embryos. This is why we have such a large stock of leftover embryos. You'd be advocating a process where you wouldn't create excess embryos, where every embryo would be implanted and given the chance of life. Does that then make the process more difficult for the family and the mother trying to conceive?
No doubt. The percentage of effectiveness would drop, but you've got to weigh that against the keeping of that circle of love, keeping of the circle of unconditional welcome and acceptance for any little life that's conceived. That's the consideration. And remember, when IVF first came into existence, I think the first IVF baby, Louise Brown, what was that, 1984, I think. But anyway, in the 80s, all the states in Australia held inquiries into the implications of this new technique. And one of the dominant findings and recommendations was this: whatever you do, do not allow freezing of embryos. Don't do it. You're buying an ethical nightmare. And they just went and did it anyway. And so you end up with...
Why was that, David? Was that just because of utilitarianism? Was it?
I can't read their motives, but in a way it's just out of goodwill of wanting to have an efficient service. And if you don't really think that embryos matter, then, to that extent, then there's no great ethical problem. But
you were saying back in the 1980s, though, they recognised this would be a problem and they said don't freeze them. That's extraordinary. I didn't know that. I don't think the public knows that this was foreseen when we first embarked on this journey.
I think it was the Dimmock Review in Queensland, if I've got his name right. But see, this is my early dawn of awareness of all these matters. And it was actually a bill in 1986 where Senator Harradine, the late beloved Senator Brian Harradine of Tasmania, drew our attention to this. They were wanting to get permission to experiment on IVF embryos. Now, there's a beautiful insight in the Senate committee report from 1986. Let me quote it to you. They said this:
please do.
The concept of guardianship of the embryo, the concept of guardianship should be adopted as the most appropriate model to indicate the respect due to the embryo. Isn't that brilliant? Again, it's keeping this little semi-artificial creation who's sitting there in a lab still part of the human family. The parents, the adults, the society are still guardians, not owners, not experimenters. We are guardians. So that was quite an insight from 1986. And it stayed the case right through to the stem cell cloning era of the early 2000s, that it was prohibited to experiment on human embryos, prohibited by the National Health Medical Research Council, Ethics Council.
Well, this is important, David, because we went from saying we're going to go down the IVF path in the 1980s, but we shouldn't allow the embryos to be frozen. That was discarded. Then we got to the early 2000s and we suddenly found we've got all these frozen embryos stored in laboratories all over Australia. And you'll remember this debate very well because John Howard was involved when he was Prime Minister. You were one of the key people advocating for the rights of human life. But our federal parliament had a conscious vote and they agreed to allow these embryos, which originally in 1986 we said shouldn't be allowed to be frozen. Now we're trying to deal with the consequences. They allowed them through a parliamentary vote to be flushed down the sinks of laboratories. And that's before we get to the cloning and experimental debate that you were just about to touch on. David, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for today, but I really appreciate you giving of your knowledge and expertise and helping unpack this deep ethical issue. And thank you for the advocacy you've given over 30 or more years in this space. You've really led the debate. And I know it's difficult for you because you've often been criticised and ridiculed, but you've always approached it from a scientific and an ethical point of view. And, of course, history will prove you right, even if the politicians ignored you. So thanks again, David.
That's the story of our life, Lyle.